Hi, everybody. It's Tim, and this is What I Saw When I Saw Midnight Cowboy. I couldn't tell you exactly how long ago it was that I first saw the movie Midnight Cowboy, but it's been at least 15 years. And recently I watched it again, and this second viewing made such an impression on me. It was as if I was seeing the movie for the first time, so I absolutely had to make this video. As I say in all my videos of this kind, I'm not arguing that what I see in this movie is the correct or the only way to interpret it, nor am I suggesting that what I see in any way reflects the intentions of the creative people who made the movie. This is just my own perspective. This video assumes that you've seen Midnight Cowboy. There are spoilers ahead. And I'm going to be referring to the character of Rico Rizzo as Rico, because, well, that's what he preferred to be called. The film Midnight Cowboy has an air of notoriety about it, as it's the only rated X movie to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. That might lead some people to think that Midnight Cowboy is pornographic, but that X rating, which was later changed, occurred before the X rating became widely applied to sexually explicit films. Anyone who thinks of Midnight Cowboy as a gritty, cynical urban drama isn't wrong, but I think that obscures how terrifically funny this movie is. I wouldn't call this movie a comedy. After all, the story involves prostitution, gang rape, sodomy, drug use, assault, and an ending that most people would consider unhappy. But Midnight Cowboy is, in spite of all that, quite comical from start to finish. So, I want to begin by calling attention to the visual wit of this movie under the direction of John Schlesinger. Here, in no particular order, is a top 10 list of my favorite visual gags in Midnight Cowboy. Number 1, dropping the soap. Whether this moment was scripted or not, Joe Buck at the beginning of this movie dropping the soap in the shower is an obvious but still funny visual hint of the sexual and homosexual encounters to come. Number 2, Joe Buck's cigarette. When Joe Buck whips around to get an admiring look at himself in the mirror, notice that his cigarette becomes erect in his mouth. Joe thinks so highly of his own sex appeal, he turns himself on. Number 3. On the bus ride at the beginning of the movie, Joe plays a game of peekaboo with a little girl who is reading a comic book. But not just any comic book. It is Wonder Woman, issue 178, released in October 1968. The cover sports a contemporary, fashionable Wonder Woman with the teaser, "Forget the old, the new Wonder Woman is here." The fact that this little girl is reading this issue hints that a new kind of woman is ascendant, something that Joe will soon find out. Later on in the movie, Joe Buck is reading a comic book, but it's too hard to tell if it's Wonder Woman. Number 4, the jewelry store window. Joe Buck approaches a woman who is admiring a piece of jewelry, a circular pin, resembling an orifice or a diaphragm, and when she walks away, before Joe has a chance to make his pitch, a hand comes and removes the pin, and it's gone, along with Joe's chances. Notice, too, that the pin is in front of a book titled Henry VIII, the famous king with many wives. Number 5, the New York City pawn shop, whose front door is adorned with a symbol that closely resembles the male genitalia. Joe is coming to the shop to pawn his true companion, his radio, for money, because he has failed to get money in exchange for his own companionship. Number 6, the Andy Warhol-style party is at a place called the Gates of Hell, and appropriately, there is Cerberus, the dog, barking as if in warning, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Number 7. In Rico's apartment, in a condemned building, the windows are marked with a giant X, which is what Rico tells Joe his father used for his signature. So whenever Rico looks through a window at the wider world, he sees his father's name. Number 8. Joe Buck and Rico pass a billboard advertising flights to Florida, and it promises steak for everybody, every lunch and dinner. But that's on the plane, not in the state. I'll discuss in due course themes of immigrant fantasies in this movie. A steak for everybody is also a pun on the word stake, as in to stake a claim. Number 9. Late in the movie, a frustrated Joe Buck goes not to a bar, but to an arcade to play a child's shooting game. And by all appearances, he is a terrible shot, and he was in the army. Joe Buck is literally shooting blanks, and he cannot seem to hit the target. Finally, number 10. On the bus to Miami, after Rico pees his pants, Joe Buck buys him new clothing from a store that's having a liquidation sale. That's all very funny stuff. If you noticed other visual gags or jokes in Midnight Cowboy, please let me know in the comments section. In some movies, it's abundantly clear who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, and we can pretty well predict which character is going to get what they want and which character will fail. Well, there's nothing wrong with these kinds of movies. To the contrary, I believe they're important and even necessary entertainments. Why? Because if one thing is certain in life, it's that life is uncertain. And some entertainments, being formulaic and predictable, satisfy our expectations in a way that's reassuring. These movies let us know and telegraph well ahead of time that good will prevail, hope will spring eternal, and that in the end, everything will be okay. That's something we always need to hear and to see. But in a movie like Midnight Cowboy, we can have a harder time determining what to think and how to feel about the characters in the story. Is Joe Buck a likable, innocent young man who we root for? Or is he a hopeless naif we feel superior to? Do we look down on Rico because he's a petty thief? Or do we like Rico because, after initially steering Joe Buck wrong, he tries to help him? Is Joe Buck our hero because he's dressed like a cowboy? And is Rico the villain because after a certain point in the film, he's in all black? Finally, do we want these two characters to succeed? Or do we want them to fail so that they might learn a lesson? Let's take a closer look at each of the main characters in this story. Joe Buck, G.I. Joe, Buck as in buckaroo, Buck as in dollar, is not a real cowboy. He admits this. He only dresses like a cowboy because he thinks the cowboy image will appeal to rich, sex-starved women in New York City. These rich women, Joe tells his colleague in the kitchen, are willing to pay for sex because most of the men in New York City are gay. The movie doesn't tell us where Joe Buck got this notion. He probably cobbled it together from impressions he received from movies or from advertisements, or from things he overheard, or from his own hopeful imagination. Joe Buck doesn't seem to consider that there are city women much closer to him in proximity, in, say, Houston or in Dallas, who would cotton to a young, blonde, blue-eyed cowboy. Joe may think that the richest women in America must live in its biggest city, and that big cities, especially on the coast, are full of homosexual men. That idea is a prejudice that's been around for a very long time. The fact is, Joe would be better off going west to Hollywood. Since before Joe was born, The movies and the theater have been reputed to be full of loose women and gay men. Had Joe gone not to New York but to Hollywood, he might have picked up work as an extra in a Western on TV or in the movies. Instead of going west, young man, Joe Buck goes east. He goes unknowingly to test truth in advertising, to see if image matches up with reality. Now, we might think that Joe's plan is silly or naive, but many men, if not most men, dress and present themselves as they have been coached to believe how men dress, or what is attractive to women. As an aside, I think most heterosexual men don't realize that the most attractive thing they can wear is a smile. A sincere, genuine smile tells women, I'm not a threat, I'm nice, I'm fun, and I can make you laugh. Joe Buck opts for the cowboy persona because everything about the cowboy, his rugged individualism, his autonomy, his strength, his youth, his defiance, is connected with sex appeal. Joe even smokes Marlboro cigarettes, surely to emulate the Marlboro Man, a cowboy character introduced in 1954. Joe Buck doesn't realize it, but he is in a form of drag. That is, a costume or performance of exaggerated gender expression. Joe is a drag king. Yes, Joe is heterosexual. He has pictures of naked women on his mirror. But the picture he has of Paul Newman as HUD is much bigger. As for Joe's biography, it's a little fuzzy. As Joe's girlfriend Annie tells him, he's the only one, which is true. Joe appears to be an only child with no parents, no siblings. He is the only one. We gather from Joe's memories that his mother left him as a child to be reared by his grandmother. Why? We're not told. We do see two women leaving him with Sally Buck, his grandmother, and one of the women is carrying a suitcase. Are these two women in a relationship? Are they friends? Are they headed off to some promised land, as Joe and Rico will be by the end of the movie? We do not know. How sad it would be if Joe's mother left him with his grandmother, promising that one day she would come back for him, and she never did. If that were the case, it wouldn't be surprising that Joe Buck would end up looking for his mother in one woman after another. Judging by his flashbacks, Joe was in the Army in the mid-1960s. We don't know where he was stationed or deployed, but it's hard to imagine that Joe Buck saw combat in Vietnam. Wherever he was stationed, the experience did not make him a savvy person, or even a skilled person. He's a grown man working as a dishwasher. As he tells Rico, the only thing he has ever been good at is lovin'. Now, how true that is, we don't know. We also do not know if Joe Buck is of low intelligence or whether he is just childlike and naive. Joe does not know how to spell the word money, which is curious, because even the U.S. Army has an intelligence and aptitude test they administer to people. I wonder if the novelist Winston Groom, who wrote the novel Forrest Gump, was in any way inspired by the character of Joe Buck. Both Joe Buck and Forrest Gump are a character type of the childlike man, the innocent, good-hearted, incorruptible man, who may not be mentally challenged, but is not the smartest or sharpest person. In many ways, Forrest Gump is more capable, skilled, and intelligent than Joe Buck. In New York City, arguably in any major U.S. city, Rico Rizzo is everywhere. He is the unshaven barfly, the garrulous guy in the barroom booth, the jaywalker and scofflaw the homeless derelict, the bum. We don't know his name. We don't want to. He looks every part the two-bit dead-end guy, as scrounging, shifty, and anonymous as a city rat. Joe Buck looks conspicuously out of place in New York City, whereas Rico is so common you don't notice him. The only time New Yorkers might notice Rico is when he's standing next to Joe Buck. There are moments when Rico shows what appears to be care and concern for Joe Buck. He cooks for him, he cuts his hair, he pickpockets a name from a male escort to set Joe up. All this seems like the work of a friend, but let's not forget that Rico appoints himself Joe's manager, nice word for a pimp, and he expects a cut, even if it's just $1. Rico surely recognizes a meal ticket when he sees it. If Rico hadn't gotten sick, who knows how much more he would have helped Joe Buck, and possibly helped himself to a bigger cut. When we first encounter Rico, however, he does not look like someone who lives in an abandoned building, one of the many examples in this movie of appearances that are deceiving. But with illness and the coming of winter, like a hard wind that strips leaves from a tree, the appearance falls away, and Rico looks like what he truly is, a fellow who has hit the skids, and hit them hard. As with Joe Buck, we know only a little bit about Rico's background. Rather, we know only what Rico decides to tell us. We are privy in the film to one of Rico's fantasies, but we are not shown his memories or his nighttime dreams. Rico tells Joe that he is from the Bronx, a borough of New York City. Rico's father, almost certainly an Italian immigrant who didn't have enough education or mastery of English to sign his own name, shined shoes. How Rico got his limp, how he became an indigent person, how or why he turned to a life of petty thievery, we do not know. The novel Midnight Cowboy by James Leo Herlihy explains this, but the movie does not. If you take the X on Rico's windows as an algebraic symbol, Rico is an unknown. Joe Buck taunts Rico and asks him when the last time was that he had sex. "That's between me and my confessor," Rico replies, which may be an accurate statement. Given Rico's stated aversion to being touched, he may have been molested as a child, perhaps as an altar boy, and who knows what effect that had on his development and his choices in life. We do know that Rico's dream is to get to Florida, the Sunshine State, for his health. In New York City of 1969, that is a perfectly reasonable wish. Back then, New York was not as environmentally conscious as it is in 2025. Perhaps the biggest question about Rico, the biggest unknown, is why he cannot manage to steal enough money or fence enough goods to afford a one-way bus ticket to Miami. My wife had an interesting theory about this. She suggested that because Rico has such a pronounced limp, it's not like he could rob a bank and make a run for it. He has to resort to petty shoplifting and picking pockets. Nothing seems to be holding Rico to Manhattan. He doesn't have a spouse, a girlfriend, or children, or ailing parents or siblings to care for. He has no job, no debts, no duty to anyone. He doesn't appear to be impaired by drug addiction, and despite his limp, he can get around the city fairly well. I pose this question about Rico, fully cognizant of the fact that in real life, you cannot reasonably ask of every homeless person in a big city, why don't you just save up your money and go someplace else? But this is a movie, not real life. And I think it's a fair question to ask about Rico, because it may give us insight into his character, and by extension, into ourselves. It's easy to harbor a fantasy about relocating somewhere else, to some other place where we think the sun always shines and where we imagine life would be so much better. Maybe Rico wants to go to Florida, but he doesn't want to be homeless there. Maybe he wishes he could go to Florida, but deep down he feels he doesn't deserve it. Or maybe he has grown more accustomed to having a wish than to acting on it. Rico Rizzo is not a Christ-like figure, and he is also not a Christ figure. His story doesn't mirror any account of Jesus, and I don't think it's the movie's intention to cast him as a Christ figure. That said, there are a conspicuous number of details and parallels between Rico and Jesus that I think are worth mentioning. Let's start with the fact that Savior is his middle name. His full name, as he tells Joe Buck, is Enrico Salvatore Rizzo. Salvatore being Italian for Savior. Rico's father's name is Dominic, which means lordly or belonging to God. His gravestone identifies him as our beloved father, and since Rico never says anything about having siblings to support or help him, we might conclude that Rico is Dominic's only son. Again, this differs in the novel. When we first meet Rico, he is in white, and when he dies, he is wearing purple. The evangelists Mark and John say that when Jesus was given a crown of thorns to humiliate him, he was dressed in a purple robe, mocking his status as the King of the Jews. When Joe and Rico show up at the party at the gates of hell, Joe Buck wipes Rico's sweating face with his shirt, calling to mind the legend of Veronica wiping the face of Jesus as he was near death. If you're Catholic, you are familiar with the Stations of the Cross, the moments leading up to Jesus' crucifixion and death, including episodes where Jesus falls to the ground 3 times. Rico falls at the party, a sign that his health is deteriorating. As Rico lies in bed, sweating, telling Joe that he has been falling more often, he lays supine with an image of Jesus at the head of his bed, not unlike a holy image at the head of one's grave. Note that Towney gives Joe Buck his St. Christopher medal. The name Christopher means Christ bearer. The legend of St. Christopher is that he charitably transports a child across a river, only to discover that the person to whom he has done this good deed is Christ himself. The degree to which Rico saves Joe Buck is a matter for debate. In a way, Rico does lead Joe to Jesus in the form of Mr. O'Daniel. And were it not for Rico, who knows what would have happened to Joe Buck? He wouldn't have ended up in Florida, having faith that the best thing for him is to abandon his cowboy persona and get a job. Like the advertisement says, Jesus saves. When Jesus is asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, of the man beset upon and ignored until he is helped by the Good Samaritan. Joe Buck turns out to be the Good Samaritan, which makes Rico everyone's neighbor. I found it hard to tell from Joe's flashbacks and memories if anything untoward occurred between him and his grandmother, Sally Buck. In some memories, she seems like a loving grandmother who was happy to take Joe Buck in. Evidently, she fed and clothed Joe, had him baptized, kissed him, complimented him, and was the very picture of a good nana. There are also, however, images of young Joe in bed with Sally Buck, and with Sally and her boyfriend, which are not necessarily suspect, but given that Joe's ambition in his young adult life is to become a gigolo, one wonders if some boundaries of propriety might have been crossed at some point in his life. Our first image of Sally Buck is of Joe rubbing her shoulders and her moaning with pleasure rewarding him with a kiss. Sally Buck is a beautician, and, arguably, an older woman who herself tries hard to look young. And we don't know how many beaus she has had while Joe is under her care. In one memory, Sally Buck tells Joe that he will be the handsomest cowboy in the parade, which the boy might take to mean that his grandmother, his de facto mother, considers him more handsome than her own beau. Sally Buck leaves $1, a buck, on the mantel so that Joe can go to the movies, which you could take innocently. Parents give children money all the time to get candy or go to the movies. But it also rings a little like a man leaving money on the dresser so that one of his conquests can get a cab ride home. The only indication that young Joe Buck was disobedient as a child is a flashback where he is spanked, and when he smashes a vanity mirror, it looks like red nail polish resembling blood has been splashed on it first. Perhaps young Joe resents being left alone while Sally Buck works at the beauty parlor or dolls herself up to go on a date, and this is his rebellion against vanity, women, sex, or perhaps just the fact that as a child he is completely dependent on his grandmother. Many a man is cruel and even violent to a woman because he resents the power she has over him. I wanted to make some mention of the Johns in Midnight Cowboy, the 4 people who have sexual encounters with Joe Buck. This would be in order: Cass, a middle-aged woman; Shirley, a younger woman; the unnamed young student; and the gentleman Townsend P. Locke, known as Townie. In Midnight Cowboy, when well-to-do people, or in the case of the young student, middle-class people, want sex, they hook up not with one of their peers, but with a stranger. None of these people, Cass, Shirley, Townie, or the student, have any idea that the only money Joe Buck has is what's in his pocket, and that he lives either in a cheap hotel or in a condemned building. But the Johns don't want someone who looks like them. What excites them, I suspect, is being with someone who is a contrast. Cass not only doesn't pay for sex, she wheedles money out of Joe Buck to the tune of $20, which in today's money is more like $150. That is Joe Buck's first lesson in the big city: never hustle a hustler. Given what we see about Cass, her manner, and the way she interacts with her husband on the phone, she clearly has made a lifetime career of using histrionics, verbal abuse, and sex to get what she wants in life. Cass manages to get money out of Joe Buck by manipulating his emotions, something Joe later tries to do with Townie, lying to him to say that he has a sick kid to care for. But Joe is not an expert in this kind of thing, as is Cass. In the end, Joe resorts to violence. Shirley strikes me as more of a slummer, a woman of wealth, either her own or what she married into, who finds it exciting, arousing, to go to a party at the gates of hell and bring a young stud back to her home. She does not mind in the least giving Joe Buck $20. She could probably give him 2 or 3 times that and not bat an eye. She's amused by Joe. She teases him, even mocks him. And in bed, she clearly likes it rough, so long as she is in charge. Shirley may be a nicer woman than Cass, but she is no less powerful. I found it a fascinating contrast in this movie that the heterosexual encounters, those between Joe and Shirley and Joe and Cass, are characterized by comedy, while the homosexual encounters, while ultimately tragic, are characterized by more depth of feeling. The young student, the picture of youthful inexperience, leans his head against Joe's torso. Rico will later do the same, out of a desire for human contact and physical intimacy. He wants sex, too, but he wants touch, closeness, an embrace. Then, when the student reveals to Joe that he doesn't have any money, he asks, "What are you going to do to me?" His voice, in saying this, sounds fearful, but also a touch excited, as if he has a masochistic desire, driven by the guilt of his homoerotic impulses. Sadly, this used to be a common trope in movie portrayals of homosexuals, that they are consumed by guilt and self-loathing, and so bad things happen to them. I think in the context of Midnight Cowboy, however, it functions well, because I don't suspect it occurs to Joe Buck that one's desire for a sexual encounter would have anything to do with guilt or a wish to be punished. Which brings us to Townsend P. Locke from Chicago, or Townie. He claims to be in New York to attend a convention, which may or may not be true. Townie appears to be refined, a city mouse who wants to hook up with a country mouse. Townie encounters Joe in an arcade of children's games, which suggests to me that Townie may be on the lookout for men perhaps a little younger than Joe. Townie is certainly warmer, more friendly, and more generous than Joe Buck's other encounters. Cass and Shirley don't offer to take Joe out to dinner first, and the young student didn't even offer to buy Joe a Coke. Townie says that he will buy Joe dinner. It's a gentlemanly thing to do before the prospect of sexual favors, and he tells Joe, "Don't worry about how you're dressed, they know me." Well, how do the restaurant owners know Townie if he's from Chicago, and he's only there on business? He tells Joe, "I'm going to have some fun, damn it," which suggests to me that Townie's life is not full of fun. I suspect that Townie denies himself pleasure in life out of guilt or low self-esteem. And I don't know about you, but if I were to have a sexual encounter with a stranger, I wouldn't be talking to my mother on the phone beforehand, as Townie does. Perhaps Townie calls his mother on certain days, at the same time of day. He also appears to have a photo of his mother by the bedside. Does Townie rely on sexual encounters for the love, affection, and attention he never received from his mother or from his father? We do not know. Townie does seem to be lecturing his mother about expense, which shows a sensitivity to money, and therefore to power and transactional relationships. All we see, all we know of this young woman, Annie, is what we see in Joe Buck's memories, his nightmares, his flashbacks. It appears that when Joe Buck was younger, very likely a teenager, he and his cohort of friends focused their attention on a young woman in town named Annie. In one scene, we see Joe and his friends following Annie down the street, and in another sequence, we see them pursuing Annie through what appears to be the dunes of a beach or a desert. The movie doesn't specify what Texas town Joe Buck comes from, but there is a desert in Texas, the Chihuahuan Desert, about 400 miles west of Big Spring, Texas, which was the location for the early scenes in Midnight Cowboy. Was the gang of boys literally chasing Annie through a desert, or did the boys consider their small town a desert of good-looking women? The movie doesn't tell us, so we don't know if the scene on the dunes is real or symbolic. What appears to happen is that Joe and Annie have a romantic encounter in a broken-down car on the property of an abandoned home, which, like Rico's building, is decrepit and ready to be demolished. Annie and Joe have rounded the bases, evidently, because they are stark naked. Presumably, they have either had sex or are about to have it. The other members of Joe's male cadre show up, what appears to be unexpectedly, and while a few of them chase Annie into the house, presumably to rape her, some of the other boys throw Joe over the hood of the car, and so it appears, sodomize him. We don't know for certain if the boys sodomize him, either with a penis or a phallic object. If they do, that's a pretty extreme way to humiliate a member of your group. Maybe the boys are jealous of Joe Buck and want to punish him for having Annie to himself. Once again, we do not know. It's a safe assumption, I think, that Annie was gang raped. The implication is that the trauma of this episode either caused her to have a nervous breakdown or she needed to be either hospitalized or institutionalized. Either way, she is branded with the name Crazy Annie, not unlike how Rico is given the name Ratso as a way to dehumanize and humiliate him. Calling a woman crazy is also a way to dismiss any claims she makes to law enforcement after being raped. It is not uncommon for people to be called crazy or to be hospitalized or institutionalized when they are not clinically insane. At a certain time in America, it was much easier than it is today to get someone, especially a woman, institutionalized as a way of controlling them, of removing them from society. We never learn what became of Annie, or whether or not any kind of legal action resulted from her being attacked. But allow me to call your attention to two curious details. The first is that as Joe is leaving town for New York, we see a water tower with the words, "Crazy Annie loves Joe Buck," spray painted on it. Well, who wrote that? And why? We don't even see Joe Buck's reaction to seeing this. And the second is that during the sequence in the movie theater, when the student is, one assumes, performing oral sex on Joe Buck, we see Joe imagining that it is Annie who is kissing him. Now, I took that to be Joe playing a mental trick on himself, to just close his eyes and imagine that the mouth on him belonged to a woman and not to a man. But during that sequence, we see a flash of images in which Joe appears to be waiting in line with the other boys while Annie is having intercourse. Is that what truly happened? Did it happen in addition to the rape episode? We see Joe and Annie having sex inside the abandoned house, but then they are set upon while they are in the car. It's confusing, and I would suggest that as far as the movie is concerned, we cannot come to any definitive conclusion about what happened with Annie and Joe and these other boys. I refer you to the novel for more clarification on this point. Something traumatic happened, and it may be that Joe is unable to process what happened and his role in it. So what plays out in his mind is a mixture of memory, dreams, and fantasies, and he no longer knows which is which. That is a scary place to be in. The opening shot of Midnight Cowboy is of a blank white space, a tabula rasa, and a slow backward tracking shot reveals it to be a drive-in movie theater screen. Since Midnight Cowboy isn't explicitly about the movies or Hollywood, why do we begin this way? I'd argue that it's because our mind is a kind of theater screen onto which we project our dreams, memories, thoughts, and fantasies. Little movies take place in our minds all the time while we're awake and while we sleep. These movies are of our own creation, conscious and subconscious, fed by the visual stimuli that we're exposed to every day. Our eyes are a camera lens, and we see and experience the world through our own private lens. Can we, however, trust everything we see? We know the answer is no, and yet we experience our day-to-day lives being deceived by images, whether it's an ad, a person in an ad, or a person in real life. Throughout Midnight Cowboy, we cut away from the main action to sequences that are either a memory, a fantasy, or a dream. On a couple of occasions, Joe hunting down Rico in Manhattan and Joe getting Rico into a taxi and onto a bus, we seem to be looking at some foreshortened version of events taking place. Most of these cutaway sequences are in color. Some are in black and white. One is in soft focus. Most are in a more realistic clarity. Director John Schlesinger does not make it clear to us what we're looking at: a dream, a fantasy, or a memory. I suspect this is intentional, to underscore that in life, it can be hard to keep these categories distinct. Our wildest fantasies contain elements of things that truly did happen, or things we want to happen, and our memories can be altered by what we wish had happened. Dreams, urges, wishes, rationalizations, fantasies, nightmares, they can all look the same in the theater of our minds. I submit then that we cannot trust what we see in these cutaway sequences. Nearly all of what the movie tells us about Crazy Annie, or Sally Buck, or Young Joe is what we see. We simply do not know for certain if what we see really happened or really happened that way. We don't know if Joe Buck was sodomized, or if he participated in the gang rape and as a way of alleviating his guilt imagines that he was raped too. You might miss it because the images flash across the screen so quickly, but Joe's memory of being sodomized appears conflated with memories of being spanked by his grandmother and administered what looks like an enema. We do not know who gave Annie the nickname Crazy Annie. We don't know who painted Crazy Annie Loves Joe Buck on the water tower, and we don't know if Sally Buck had a lot of beaus, or if she herself accepted money for sex. So it is in life. We meet someone new, the way Joe Buck meets Rico, and we assume that everything they tell us about themselves or about their past is the truth. With some people, that story about their past, about who they are, about what they want or wish for, about what they value, is as misleading as an advertisement and as the persona they dress up in. That, I believe, is one of the hard truths of Midnight Cowboy, that we can never know the whole truth about someone, or perhaps even the whole truth about ourselves, and that each of us, in our own way, has a little bit of the naively trusting Joe Buck in us, and a little bit of the con man, Rico Rizzo, in us too. I'm sure that somewhere out there, someone has written their dissertation on the role of TV, movies, and advertisements in Midnight Cowboy. We see them again and again in this film, along with recurring shots of windows and mirrors. Joe Buck uses mirrors to talk to himself, as if his real self is talking to the image of himself, or vice versa. Rico has a mirror too. Joe Buck and Shirley look at each other in a mirror before their sexual encounter. Cass looks at herself in a mirror after her sexual encounter with Joe, and there are mirrors in the men's room where Joe Buck confronts the young student. We think that by looking in a mirror, we are seeing a true reflection. Of course, that is not entirely so. What we are seeing is another projection, another image, another movie on which we base our idea of ourselves. This topic of mirrors and reflections and images made me come up with another top 10 list of my favorite such moments in Midnight Cowboy. So in no particular order, here they are. Number 1. Joe Buck has a sexual encounter with Annie in a car, not unlike how many young people have romantic encounters at a drive-in theater. The car is old and broken down, just like the movie theater in Joe's town, which is old and out of business. Number 2. It appears that the last movie that the movie theater was showing was Remember the Alamo with John Wayne. Later on in the movie, Joe Buck will defend John Wayne's cowboy persona as a real man against Rico's statement that the cowboy look is for homosexuals. The irony is cemented when Joe Buck, dressed as a cowboy, has a homosexual encounter in a movie theater. Number 3. Joe Buck recalls his grandmother leaving him money before she goes out on one of her dates. Young Joe is watching television, so there you have a very neat conflation of money, sex, and projected images. Number 4. A television is on while Joe Buck has sex with Cass, and as their bodies roll around, they hit the remote control to change stations on the television. So, sex is literally what drives television. Titillation, seduction, gratification, and of course, money. Number 5. In the scene where Joe Buck and the young student go to see a movie, what's playing is not a movie, but an episode from a TV show called Men in Space. And the name of that episode is Moon Probe. Okie doke. Number 6. The Warholian Party is like a movie theater, a place of projections, of images, and as we see with Joe Buck, a place of sexual encounters. The place is decorated with images of sex, Marilyn Monroe, and comedy, W.C. Fields. Number 7. That poster image of W.C. Fields is from the Western comedy My Little Chickadee. W.C. Fields is playing poker. Number 8. Joe Buck and Shirley look at themselves in a mirror at the party, another screen, another projected image, and they have their first romantic encounter in a dark room. Literally, a dark room where photos are being developed. Number 9. Joe Buck at the party is filmed. He becomes an actor in a movie, but he acts more naturally than other people who are likely projecting a persona for the camera. And finally, number 10, at a certain point, Joe Buck appears to go back to the movie theater, either to watch a movie, stay warm, or escape the reality of New York City. He falls asleep, and a policeman wakes him up. Now, the author James Joyce, in his novel Ulysses, has his character Stephen Dedalus say that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. Joe Buck needs to wake up too, from his own reverie, his own fantasy, his memories, his past. And what might his fantasy be? My father's parents and my mother's grandparents came to the United States as immigrants. Like so many people then and now, they came in search of a better life, which for them meant better opportunities to make money so they could raise a family. They came to the United States not because they'd paid a visit here and decided to relocate. Instead, they came because they'd heard stories about the United States. Stories of plenty, of bounty. The United States of America was their promised land. Reportedly, one of my great-grandfathers really did believe that in America, the streets were paved with gold. That's what he often said, anyway. And as it happened, he ended up living not far from Gold Street in Boston. The fantasy of a land of abundance carries with it the notion that riches are as easily obtained as picking apples from a tree. Joe Buck seems to think he can walk down any street in Manhattan, approach any woman, and get sex. Obviously, this is no more true for New York City as it is for the little town in Texas from which Joe came. For Rico, the promised land is Florida. He says he wants to go there for his health, but when he is near death, Rico expresses a deeper, more personal reason for going there. In Florida, no one will call him Ratso. In this way, Rico is not unlike an immigrant who wishes to leave behind his old name for a new one, a new identity, a new life. Rico believes that in Florida, he can reinvent himself. In Rico's fantasy of himself in Florida, his handicap disappears. He outruns Joe Buck on the beach. Older women love Rico. They call to him from their balconies and wave to him with smiles. Like the host of a party that never ends, Rico prepares a massive buffet for everyone, a feast of plenty. He calls numbers for bingo so that the women can win money he takes back from them in a dice game. Many of the women who love Rico so much look old enough to be his mother, which may be the psychological point of the fantasy. In Florida, Rico has 100 mothers who all love him. Or maybe he likes older ladies because they have more money than younger women. In any event, Rico imagines himself surrounded by abundance. He has more than enough. The reality, however, is that Rico seems to be trapped in New York City. He has no job, no family, no friends, no visible ties to anyone. He doesn't have a legal place to stay. The life he lives is the immigrant's nightmare, that they will come to this new world, to this land of plenty, and end up with nothing, homeless, destitute, and sick. The movie doesn't tell us how or why Rico ended up this way. When Rico talks about his father, who was very likely an immigrant, he speaks of him with a mixture of sympathy and scorn. He laments how hard his father worked. He calls him dumb, and yet he cares enough to visit his father's grave, and, true to his nature, he steals flowers to lay at his father's headstone. I wonder if Rico came to distrust the promise of the American dream, work hard and you'll be rewarded, by seeing what hard work got his father. But we don't know that Dominic Rizzo was an unhappy man. Being a shoe shiner in America may have been a vast improvement over life back in the old country. But for Rico, at least, it wasn't enough somehow. Rico wanted more for his father, more for himself, and perhaps he doesn't trust that he could get there through education, hard work, and good behavior. As I've pointed out, nothing is holding Rico Rizzo to New York City. Nothing is holding Joe Buck there either. They have no professional or personal attachments, no spouses, no children, no ailing parents to care for. Other people, in contrast, are either trapped or they don't realize how much freedom they have. That is the American comedy and tragedy. We prize and value freedom so much, but we don't appreciate how much we have. And if we did, we wouldn't know what to do with it all. I find Midnight Cowboy to be a quintessentially American story, both comic and tragic. Our two protagonists want to be somewhere else, to become someone else, and that is a distinctly American desire. Now, Midnight Cowboy is an award-winning and revered movie. Rico's "I'm walking here" is number 27 on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest movie quotes. But why isn't this movie shown more often on cable or celebrated more often? Let me know in the comments what you think, but I suspect it may have something to do with a surprising quality of this movie, released in 1969 with an X rating. And that is how conservative this movie is. By the end of the movie, Joe Buck realizes that the best way forward for him is the straight and narrow. That is, to stop wearing a costume, to stop being a prostitute, stop trying to be something he is not, and to get a paying job. He has traded in his fantasy of being a slick hustler for being a wage earner. And who knows, he might even date a nice girl who works at a diner. Even Rico is surprisingly conservative. Rico tells people in the city who are protesting, almost certainly protesting the war in Vietnam, to get a job when he doesn't even have one. Rico disdains homosexuals, and he thinks the pop artists Hansel and Gretel are freaks. Rico is a petty thief, an opportunist, and he never talks about finding work in Florida. He seems to think he can live on the beach, soak up the sunshine, drink coconut water, and enjoy life in paradise. He ends up dying. And worse, he gets to see the promised land, but not enter into it. The message here is that crime doesn't pay, and unrealistic fantasies don't pay off. What's more, homosexuals in Midnight Cowboy are portrayed as weak, self-loathing, guilt-ridden people who do not thrive. The rich, or the well-to-do, are portrayed as spoiled perverts who are primarily interested in the gratification of their carnal desires through games of power and control. Finally, the big city is portrayed as overwhelming, impersonal, and decadent. Those are messages that very much appeal to a conservative middle-class audience. I wonder if part of the reason why Midnight Cowboy is not more revered, discussed, or shown is because even though the movie has a lot of sex and violence, its ultimate message is counterculture. Well, I hope you've enjoyed taking this look at Midnight Cowboy with me. And if you like this video, send it to a friend and see some of the other videos I've made on this channel. And I encourage you to read the novel Midnight Cowboy by James Leo Herlihy. It's not a very long novel, and I was surprised to find out that it takes half the novel for Joe Buck even to leave Texas. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.